Becoming a student again. How a late night call reminded me to lead with curiosity, not judgment. So I had a frustrating moment recently. It started with a late night call. I need help now. On the other end was a technical expert on our team, stuck on what seemed to me anyway, like a simple problem with an obvious solution. The solution involved a single feature on one of our tools, a function that would save tens of hours of grunt work if the team would go ahead and actually use this little bit of our technology. Simple, efficient, obvious. And we ultimately implemented the solve. But as I hung up the phone, I was extremely frustrated. I hung up the phone in a bit of a huff. Now, I think I didn't do so without projecting that onto my colleague, but as I hung up, I was pretty damn frustrated. And I was wondering, why the hell did I, the old guy on the team, know more about our technology stack than someone a decade younger than me? Shouldn't they, by default, be the expert? Why was I the one staying abreast of these tools when I no longer needed to be hands on with them? Well, let's rewind a little bit. When I began my career in public affairs, I was convinced that I was one mistake away from getting fired. And that fear drove the way I engaged with my boss and with the more experienced senior people around me. And I believed in a certain transaction that I would offer value, or at least I would try to offer value as the junior person in exchange for mentorship. And so every time my boss gave me his time, I would repay him with effort, with knowledge, or some insight that made his job easier. And for me, there was a particular niche that I thought I could own in which I could provide that side of the transaction. And that meant mastering the tools of my trade. And if there was a new technology or a faster way of working, I made it my business to know it. It was a point of pride. And perhaps somewhere along the way, it became an expectation that I started projecting onto others. That expectation being that if you are young, you're going to have to know more about the latest technology, platforms, and solutions than anyone else around you. Now, years later, I'm sometimes the one in the mentor role. And if I'm honest, I still expect this dynamic. I expect this to work the same way. In fact, that I, as the gray-haired person in the room, I want to be on the receiving end of that exchange. I want the young person to educate me about latest technology and platforms. And that's because I used to, in some ways, look at mentorship as a one-way street. I try to offer value, and my boss would offer guidance. But I was prepared for that to be a one-way street where there was no expectations of me receiving guidance in the way. I always wanted my boss to walk away going, huh, that fella taught me something new, or he's got an interesting perspective, or gosh, isn't he staying on top of his trade craft? So I thought it was a one-way relationship. But the best mentorship relationships that I've benefited from when I reflect on these are they're very cyclical, where knowledge flows in both directions. And the mentors that I've most benefited from, who have been the most influential in my life, are the ones that came after at that relationship with a great deal of humility and, let's be honest, entertained me more than I ever deserved to be when I was much younger and and wetter around the ears. So the question is, why did I become in this moment, when I received this late night phone call, why did I become frustrated in that moment? Well, the answer, I think you probably know, is this: ego. In his book, Ego's the Enemy, Ryan Holiday talks about the dangers of assuming we know more than we do. And he's got this quote that I quite like, and it goes as follows: "The pretense of knowledge is our most dangerous vice because it prevents us from getting any better. Studious self assessment is the antidote." And yet, in the moment I got that late night phone call, I fell into precisely that trap. I had the answer, and it seemed so obvious to me that I ultimately judged my younger colleague for not knowing it already, which of course is a petulant reaction to have. That's precisely the role I'm expected to play, to spot the quick solve. Had this person not called me, the team would have spun their wheels for an additional 10 hours at least, probably even upwards of 20 hours. And then, had we gone down that path, I would have been even more frustrated. So ultimately, they made the right call, quite literally, in calling me. And what I missed was their courage and their humility. They called me not as an expert, but as a student, willing to put their ego aside and ask for help. In contrast to that, I immediately put my ego on a pedestal. I came into that interaction expecting to be presented with a difficult problem to solve. This is what I'm paid for, to solve big, complex problems, not simple, obvious ones. And so when the solution seemed so obvious, I got judgy. Why don't they know this already? Can you think of a better way to destroy a relationship with a colleague than to commit this sin? Because I certainly can't think of that many. My colleague did not call me with the pretense of knowledge. They called me as a student, and the power of being a student is that it places the ego in someone else's hands. In this case, they put their ego in my hands, and I failed to be delicate with it. Because in truth, in that moment, yes, I had more knowledge, but on a totally different technical question. That same person would have had much more knowledge than me. And in fact, I know that this person carries way more knowledge on so many different technical tools, platforms, and features than I do. And this person, as a result, has a fountain of knowledge that I've barely tapped into. So on a different day with a different question, I might be the one calling them. And so, whether by accident or intention, and even though it took me a couple hours to learn my lesson, I came to realize that I'm still the student. How often do we let ego block the flow of knowledge and collaboration in our teams? I'm afraid to say, at least in my case, it is more often than I'd like to admit. Next time, I'll remind myself to pause, recognize the courage it takes to ask for help, and approach the conversation as a fellow student, not a judge. Because the truth is, the best teams that I've worked on are the ones where everyone feels safe to learn and feels safe to be curious. And yes, they are safe to make mistakes and ask what at first blush might seem like dumb questions because they know they won't be judged in that moment. Ego, on the other hand, gets in the way of all of this. It destroys the most productive teams that I've ever been on. And that is the single biggest difference in my 20 plus years experience between the teams that have been highly efficient, highly effective, and amazing to work on versus the ones that I've absolutely despised being on. The ones I despise being on is where egos went unchecked and got in the way of progress. So this is a reminder more for myself than anyone, but in case it's helpful to you, I asked this question. When was the last time I set aside my expertise, approached a colleague with curiosity, and became the student? Well, it certainly wasn't on this last interaction, but I'm going to try and make it on the next one.